Hello to those who've just joined us.
Oh, hi, Cohen.
Am I there?
Hi, Pete. You are there.
I can't see myself on my screen, which is
Oh,
weird.
you are there.
We can see you. Oh, so I'm going to start off.
Sanjay is remarkably still.
Okay, we may hopefully not too many people have got connection problems tonight. So I'm going to just start off with the usual roundup, if that's okay, of things that are happening in the world that are relevant to Results' work overall. And as we've talked on a number of occasions, and I mentioned it last month, around a third of the UK's official development assistance, or ODA, budget is currently being spent on supporting refugees and asylum seekers in their first year in the UK. Now, this is completely legal, but it is not being done by other host nations. Now, that means that the money is being spent by the Home Office. And I mentioned this in the past, excuse me. I mention it again for two main reasons. First, obviously, it reduces the amount of money being spent on poverty reduction around the world. Now, last month, I think I said that the Parliament's International Development Select Committee issued a report picking up on this. Now, this has now been followed by another report, this time by the Independent Commission on Aid Impact, or ICAI, which has found that not only is this about £3.5 billion of spending, reducing the UK's support for development and humanitarian programmes around the world, but it's also found that it's not being spent as effectively as it should be, and the Home Office is failing to control costs and achieve value for money. Now, we'll put a link to a media article about this in the chat box if you want to read a bit more. Now, the report says that the Foreign Office, and I quote here, lacking an accurate forecast from the Home Office of the sharply rising ODA spend on in-donor refugee costs, that's the cost of refugees coming to this country, was forced to put its own programming on hold despite the risk to its partnerships and the many people around the world who rely on UK development and humanitarian aid, end quote. So that speaks for itself. Secondly, we're concerned about inadvertently playing into stereotypes of refugees as being a cost to society, rather than depicting them as individuals and families who are extremely vulnerable and need our support every bit as much as vulnerable communities in other countries. Now, last month I said we were about to publish a blog on this topic, and we now have done. And not only did it go up on our website, but it was picked up by the International Development Umbrella Organisation, BOND, and it's on their website as well. And we are going to put that in the chat box so you can have a look at that yourself. I think it's just gone in there. And this post was written by Ruthie just before she moved on from Results. And we're really grateful to her for making sure that this issue has been prominent in sector-wide discussions. We think it's an important contribution to this debate about how we use language to depict people living in poverty in a way that's dignified, and it does not reinforce negative or untrue stereotypes of people as being unable to make choices for themselves, whether they're in this country or somewhere else in the world. Now, we also heard just this Friday, so last Friday, a few days ago, that the government has only just released its figures for ODA spending for the period 2022 to 23, which is 8 months later than it should have done, and without the detail necessary to see how the money is actually being spent. Now, this lack of transparency is something that's also come up before, and it's a real concern to organisations like Results, because without knowing where the money's going, we can't advocate for changes that will make the spending more effective. So things that we're always doing, for example, with our advocacy on TB, immunisation, nutrition, education, all of those things. If civil society organisations don't have the information and therefore can't speak out, then there's a real risk to our democracy and democratic accountability, as well as to the effectiveness of the UK's contributions to international development programmes. We're just going to put a link to that statement in the chat box as well, should you want to go and check that out for yourself. Now, on that very sombre topic, we have noticed another report that recently downgraded the UK's reputation internationally for enabling open, free public discourse, or what's been called civil society space, something that is vital not only for a functioning democracy, but also for organisations such as Results to do our work, quite simply. and for you as advocates to attempt to engage in positive discussions about the UK's priorities and policies on international development. Now, back at the start of the year, some of you would have been on our January conference call. We heard from Sue Tibbles from the Sheila McKechnie Foundation, who presented some very sobering information about how this civic space in the UK has been facing many legal, political and cultural challenges over the past few years as a result of multiple government decisions. She urged us to be bold and determined in speaking out about this, and a new report called the Civicus Monitor Annual Report, entitled People Power Under Attack, released just on the 16th of March, very much backs up those concerns that she shared with us. So the UK sadly joins 39 other countries where civil society space has been rated as, quote, obstructed, unquote. Once again, Bond covers this concern really well, and a link to them is in the chat. You've just seen it posted there. And I think we'll also just repost the recording to our grassroots conference call with Sue Tibbles for anyone who missed it. She was a really good speaker, although I'm afraid I only heard it as a recording. I wasn't there on the night.
Bloody hell.
Indeed. Yeah, do go and have a look at that link. It's quite a sobering comparison. On a more positive note, I want to say a big thank you to everyone who's taken action over the last couple of months in the run-up to World TB Day on 24th of March, just last week. In a minute, Aurora will give a roundup of all your efforts in this regard, and I want to say just a quick something about how the work that you do and the work that Results staff in the office do, and hopefully complement and reinforce each other. So some of you invited your MP to join a World TB Day event in Parliament, which was held on the 22nd of March. The event was well attended by parliamentarians, various TB stakeholders, civil servants, and doctors and nurses from around the UK who work with TB patients daily. Some of the MPs who attended were specifically there because grassroots campaigners had reached out to them and their offices. So a big thank you from the TB team at Results for all your help and support that you continue to provide. And we've got just a quick link to a Twitter post, which hopefully gives you a flavour. There's a little picture of the event. And lastly, from me, we're going to share one more link in the chat, this time a blog post for World TB Day by Sahira Ramzan, our Senior Policy Advocacy Officer on TB, who some of you will have heard speak on our February conference call. And she's writing there about why the mission to end TB by 2030 matters, and that was posted on or very close to World TB Day. So I'm going to shut up at this point and hand over to Aurora to share a bit about your activities around the UK over the last month.
Hi, hi everybody. It's sometimes a bit tense time because it's just bedtime over here. But yes, I will. Thank you, Naveed. Thanks for passing over. I will now give you guys a bit of a kind of roundup of all of the things that have been going on in the network. And like Naveed said, we did have quite a lot of action leading up to World TB Day. But first of all, I want to let you know about. Oh, someone coming in. I want to let you know about our national conference plans, which are, starting full steam ahead now. And for that, we just really want to ask you to already save the date. We're planning on holding it on the 8th, 9th, and 10th of July. So the topic will be very much around grassroots voices and advocacy, and we'll be touching on national issues as well. And this idea came a lot from the network. So in the grassroots survey that we had in the beginning of the year, many of you expressed the desire to connect with more UK issues and campaigns. So we believe that the conference will be a really good opportunity to kind of bring that together, advocacy and grassroots voices all across, not just in international development or the issues that we explore, but in general, grassroots advocacy. So yeah, look forward to that and more updates on that to come soon. And another new thing that has happened is that Stephen from London group has set up a Discord page. I don't know if you are familiar with Discord. It's kind of a forum type of site, and it's quite new, so it will be populated soon. But I think it was a really great initiative of his, because it gives you the opportunity to collaborate and communicate across groups much more. And also for your individual groups, you might find it useful to use it for information or communications or so on. So I will share a link with you for that now in the chat. And yes, so let's get on with the all of the actions that you guys have been up to for World TB Day. We were really proud to share Jill's publication that she got in the Independent Catholic News, and it was really great on raising awareness for TB. We also shared it on our social media, so if you haven't had a chance to check that out, I will put it in the chat. Ricky and Karen, from what I understood, they're planning to meet the MP Joanna Cherry tomorrow, so this will be to come. Scotland has been really active in general with loads of meetings, and many of them have written to the MP and across the network really. So we have had letters by Jill, Ricky, Kathy, and William had a beautiful handwritten letter that we got at Resource. I was so touched when I saw that. That was really cool. Thank you. And Alex and Mira, so Brighton, they have in Brighton they have seen the MP Lloyd Russell Moyle and to discuss TB, and he has agreed to write to the minister, which is really great. Thank you for that. Thank you all of you, and we encourage you, as you know, just want to end on that note that you can copy me into your emails that you send to your MP or to the minister or prime minister, which is the case for this month. Copy me in just so I know you've taken the action, or otherwise just send me a short message to Carrie met with her meeting too. Oh, thank you. Yeah, Carrie, yeah, she met with Preet Jill, didn't she? I thought I had mentioned that last month, but yeah, she got a great picture as well with Preet Jill, which was really great, and we shared that as well. Yes, exactly, the great picture. What was I saying? Yes, copy me into your emails or send me a message to let me know, because it's always good to know what you guys have been up to, and especially if you get any replies from your MP or from any office that you have written to, let me know as well, because it's really good to also for our team kind of in the office, for them to know what's been going on and who has said what. It gives them quite a great encouragement, I'd say. So you can find always my email at the bottom of your action sheet, and I'll share it with you as well right here in the chat. And yes, that's everything from me, and I'll pass it over to Naveed again to introduce the speaker for tonight. Thanks.
Thank you, Aurora, and a massive thank you, as Aurora said, to everybody for taking action in the run-up to World TB Day, and obviously on all the other things that you're working on as well. So it is time to introduce our guest speaker for this evening, who I notice has just joined us. It is my great pleasure to welcome Zander Wollcombe to this call. Zander is the Senior Advisor working on Pandemic Prevention, Preparedness and Response for the Pandemic Action Network. And let me just check if I can see. Yes, I can see him. Welcome, Zander. So I'm just going to share a bit from his biography, which he's kindly shared with us. Zander is, as well as being working for the Pandemic Action Network, he advises the Eleanor Crook Foundation and the Hungry for Action campaign on global malnutrition and hunger, has worked for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the One campaign, Oxfam, and David Cameron. He is the co-founder of the United for Global Mental Health, speaks for the Stability Network, and is on the boards of Search for Common Ground and United Against Malnutrition and Hunger, as well as acting as a consultant for many other organisations. So that's quite a good CV there. Zander, very welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you, William and Elizabeth Ross, for the hand claps. That was very kind of you through the meeting. button, and it's lovely to be back. I did a call like this, I think about 11 years ago, the EU multi-annual financial framework. And I think it's amazing that you guys give up your Tuesday evenings to do this kind of thing and highlight the things that are important but often get forgotten about by some of the campaigning organizations for things that might be more flashy but might not necessarily be as influential as the really important work that you do. So thank you very much for inviting me. And yeah, it's lovely to be here.
Thank you, Zander, and it's lovely to be joined by a veteran of our calls. I have to admit that's a little bit before my time and probably not before the time of some of the people on the call, but really happy to have you back with us. So thank you for being with us this evening. So you'll know from past experience that you're with our grassroots volunteers from around the UK, some of which have been campaigning on global poverty issues for many years, including health issues, such as TB, malnutrition, immunisation, but also some people who are very new to results. So in a minute, you'll know that we've got some pre-arranged questions for you to get the discussion started. But before that, I'd like to invite you to say a bit more about yourself, really as much as you feel comfortable with, about your own journey as an advocate on international development issues, and kind of what drives you to do the work that you do for all of those organisations that you've been involved with.
Sure. Can you hear me? You just cut out a bit then. Am I coming through okay?
You are. Did you hear my question?
Yes. You want me to talk about myself?
Yes, please.
I'll try and limit it to, half an hour. No, very briefly. My parents, I think Jill might know them, set up a charity called Peace Child when I was a year old. That was a musical inspired by music by Cat Stevens's brother and a French Buddhist monk called Bernard Benson, and it was a story of the Peace Child. And in Papua New Guinea, after they had a conflict, they would exchange a child who would then grow up and live with the tribe of their supposed enemy. And then the next time there was a conflict, the peace children would mediate because they understood the other culture. And my dad was a film director, my mum was an actress, and my granny had left my grandfather, who was a spy in MI9 during the war, for the head of the UN peacekeeping mission in Cyprus, and set up a thing called Generals for Peace. And so they were quite sort of incongruous in the late 70s, early 80s peace CND movement for being relatively old and quite posh and from the military. But they created this musical called Peace Child, where a Russian girl falls in love with an American boy. And if they can learn to love each other, then why do their leaders need to keep on building nuclear weapons? And the central insight from my dad was that bringing young people together from different cultures who'd been brought up to hate or fear each other was much more powerful if you allowed them to tell their own stories rather than giving them a script. And so we performed it in the Royal Albert Hall, and then we moved to America, and we moved 32 times in 4 years around the United States and took young people to the Soviet Union, brought Russians back to America. And this was all during the sort of Glasnost perestroika period. And yeah, it was a very unusual upbringing because we toured around Central America and went to South Africa and Eastern Europe. And I think my whole career has been driven by a desire to figure out what the hell was going on when I was a kid. And how does change happen and what actually drives change. So I think my desire to go and work for David Cameron and Bill Gates and Oxfam and Bono and Bob Geldof was really that my parents did very much grassroots sort of community organizing and activation. And I felt like no one was really listening to a bunch of young people. Thank you, Jill. My parents are amazing, revolutionary people. But I always felt like children singing songs about peace in sort of community theatres wasn't really what changed anything, that actually it was politics and the big sort of influential figures and organizations in the world who are able to drive change. And I guess I also wanted to understand why my parents' charity didn't become like Greenpeace or Oxfam, and sort of what makes things grow and what doesn't, and where change happens. And I guess after having worked in this field for now coming up for 20 years, I found that you need a balance of both. You need the grassroots stuff, and you need the inspiration of young people and ordinary people with genuine stories and concerns. And then you need the influential people to get this on the radar of politicians who otherwise don't care. And, you know, I think the last 7 years have been incredibly depressing for the work that we do, just because it's so hard. But it's also been interesting because I think quite a lot of us were so focused on how many things were going wrong in the rest of the world that we didn't really pay much attention to what was going wrong in the UK. Jo Cox was my first boss at Oxfam. She worked for me as a consultant when she was running to be a Labour MP. And I think, you know, my desire to be a consultant and so not be in the sort of rat race of being part of the Gates Foundation's machine was caused a bit by Brexit and her murder, and trying to understand how to get the balance right between doing the high level advocacy, which is interesting and exciting, but also trying to be a bit more connected to where I am and things that are affecting me, and that was why I got involved in the mental health campaign, and that was interesting too. So I like the diversity. I think pandemic preparedness and malnutrition are two things which are really fundamental to improving the lives of the world's poorest people, and I think both don't get the attention that they deserve, and so therefore by focusing attention on them you can maybe make a bigger difference than you can perhaps on issues which are more oversubscribed in terms of popularity and profile.
Thank you, Zander. That's an incredibly interesting story, and I'm sure we'd love to hear loads more about that. We'll see how we get on with the questions. And really interesting to hear your observations on that link between the high level advocacy that's needed and the kind of the grassroots kind of issues that people bring up in all their diversity, really. So thank you so much for sharing that. I'm going to head over to our pre-prepared questions before opening to the floor, as always. So I think I'm right in saying the first question is from Paul. I see a nod from Helen.
That's it. Hello, yes, it's from Paul. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, Zander, can you tell us, please, why vaccine research and development is so important for pandemic prevention and preparedness and response? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think on some level everyone knows why it's so important, because COVID shows what happens when you don't have enough of it. And I think, you know, it's not a coincidence that one of the first vaccines to come through was the Oxford AstraZeneca one, and that was in part funded by CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, and that was actually a vaccine that they'd been working on linked to SARS and MERS, which were outbreaks a few years ago, and it turned out that it was able to be morphed or kind of worked into a vaccine for COVID. So yeah, if we don't have enough research and development into vaccines, then the next pandemic, which will come at some point in the coming years, will be worse if there isn't more of it. So the more vaccine research and development there is, the better able the world will be to prevent the next pandemic from spreading so far, because ideally you could you know, like a fire engine, send it to the cause of the fire before it becomes a raging inferno and still able to be contained in a small space.
Thanks, Zander. I like that fire engine analogy. I'm sure we're going to go more in the sort of follow-up questions into prevention, preparedness and response in the different aspects. So let's move on to our second question. We might have made a bit of a mess with some of these questions. Is there someone from Scotland prepared to ask the second question? We may have made a mistake here. Oh, Bentley, hello. I didn't see you. Welcome, Bentley.
Yeah, well, no one really took on the second question, but I'm prepared to ask it there.
Thank you.
Hi, Zander.
Hi.
I'm going to say, how does CEPI work address the challenges, and why is their work so important?
Well, I think some of us on the call might be familiar with Gavi, which is the Global Alliance on Vaccines and Immunizations, and both Gavi and CEPI kind of solve a similar problem from different angles. And the thing is, if the world of vaccines is left only to the private sector and the market, then it will only produce vaccines that are useful for people who can afford to pay for them. So predominantly in high income countries in the global north. And, you know, I remember when I was about 18 seeing this statistic about how much more money was spent on Viagra research and stopping male pattern baldness than was in trying to find a cure for malaria or TB or HIV, and thinking that was awful. And even now, I still agree with that, despite my hair situation. But I think when it comes to trying to make sure that vaccines go to where they're needed most, what CEPI does is it kind of creates a market mechanism to incentivize the private sector to invest in research and development and vaccines for diseases that otherwise wouldn't be commercially viable. So, you know, CEPI was set up in reaction to, in response to the Ebola crisis, because, you know, there's been Ebola for a number of years in different parts of Africa and different outbreaks. And to be honest, the reason why the outbreak in 2015-16 got so much global attention was because people were scared that it was going to come to Europe and North America. And so you had this flood of money into Ebola. And then once it became clear that it wasn't coming into the West, then interest and funding for it waned. And so you get this thing, and we are experiencing it now with COVID. They call it the cycle of panic and neglect, that when there's an outbreak and a pandemic and everyone thinks they're going to die, everyone panics and they throw money at the problem. And then as soon as the pandemic passes, they go, oh, we don't want to think about that. That was a bad time. We feel very poor now because we have had to spend so much money. So we just don't want to think about pandemics happening again, because surely lightning won't strike twice. So what CEPI does is it creates that market for things like Ebola vaccines or vaccines for other diseases that predominantly affect people in the global south. And then it also, through providing ongoing continuous funding, helps to avoid the cycle of panic and neglect. And by providing regular sort of funding, so that in terms of being prepared for the next pandemic and also being able to respond quickly, CEPI is well positioned to move quickly, like they did with the Oxford AstraZeneca, adapting that vaccine from a previous disease. But, you know, in the same way, if you go to Kew Gardens, they have a massive sort of seed repository of every seed in the world. CEPI is trying to build kind of a vaccine library for a number of diseases. They call the disease that is going to be the next COVID that we don't know what it is, disease X, as in it could be anything. But the more sort of different types of vaccines they've got on their library, the more likely they are when a new sort of pandemic or very, very contagious disease like the next sort of COVID comes along, that they will have the tools in their toolkit to be able to jump in and squash it quickly. And I think, you know, through doing that in terms of creating a market mechanism and investing in research and development capacity, and hopefully also manufacturing capacity for vaccines in different parts of the world, they are putting in place the building blocks along with others to make sure that the next time we have a COVID-like situation, the world's able to respond in a more equitable way and also quicker, because that's the main problem. And that's what we saw in COVID, was that the world did actually respond pretty quickly and the vaccine production was amazing. But the main vaccine production center for the global south was the Serum Institute in India. And that was expected to produce so many vaccines that it would export them all to wherever they were needed in Africa and South Asia and beyond. But then when it came to it, India had a massive COVID surge, and Prime Minister Modi just said, like all the other countries did, no, banning exports, we're keeping it all. And that vaccine nationalism that we experienced will only be overcome if we have a more diversified, globally distributed system through which to produce and research and find and deliver the vaccines that are needed in the different parts of the world at the right time and the right way.
Thank you, Zander. That's a really full explanation there. I'm sure we'll delve into that some more. I was struck when you talked about that cycle of panic and neglect, how kind of Western centric that was, and how I think we as results have been really thinking about the unfairness of that and the inequity. And in fact, we produced a policy paper about a year or more back now, which really looked at some commentators on this really being quite xenophobic and racist around who should be involved, who should have access and who shouldn't. So there's a lot of unfairness in the system there that I think we've all observed over the last couple of years as we've been asking you and in the network to take action on this. It's one of the reasons that Results is so interested in this, and I'm sure we'll delve into that a bit more later. We have a third preset question, which was going to be asked by someone from Norwich, but I just earlier on was told that they can't join the call, so I'm going to ask it on their behalf. I think this happened last month as well, but this time I'll just ask it for them. So Zander, in 2021, the G7 committed to reducing the time taken to develop new vaccines to just 100 days. I believe in saying that for COVID it was around 300 odd days. Can you tell us a bit more about what the opportunities are to influence this year's G7, which hopefully is focused on this issue?
Yeah. Well, I'm not someone to praise Boris Johnson lightly or in fact ever. But if you are ever looking for something to say he didn't do a bad job on, the 100 Days mission came out of the UK's hosted G7 in 2021, largely driven by our excellent chief scientific advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance. And it's a really exciting idea that this, if you could get the time it takes to go from finding out that there's a very contagious emerging infectious disease like COVID and squash it and and control it within 100 days, as opposed to 300 days, the amount of money and lives and pain and misery that would have been saved by doing that is extraordinary. So it's a really exciting idea. It got taken forward by the German G7 in 2022, and this year Japan's hosting the G7, and they've had a long-standing sort of interest in universal health coverage. Japan's got one of the most rapidly aging populations in the world, so they're very interested and innovative and ahead of, I think, most of the rest of the world in thinking about digital health, which is something they're putting a focus on, because they just don't have enough people to look after their elderly, and how you keep people healthier for longer is a big sort of, it's a national security issue. It's not just a public health issue. And we think we've got problems with our NHS and social care system, and we certainly do. But in Japan, the numbers are even scarier. And so this has been a central plank, global health, of the Japanese G7. They haven't talked about 100 Days mission perhaps as much as we'd like, but given that there have been two prime ministers since, in the last, I guess he's been there for 9 months now. So, this was something that the Rishi Sunak might have been mildly aware of when it happened in the G7 meeting in 2021 in Cornwall. But it's really been pushed at an official level and a ministerial level over the last 2 years through the G7 Sherpa process, also within the G20. And it's got a lot of energy, because one of the things that's been interesting is that whilst the political attention on preparedness and these issues has waned as COVID ceased to be such an immediate priority, at a technical and sort of high official level, and even sometimes ministerial, there's still a big recognition that this was a massive blind spot going into COVID, the recognition of how important this issue was, not just as a global health issue, but as a global security issue and a geopolitical consideration. When you've got the Russians and the Chinese going into Africa saying that the West screwed you basically with COVID vaccines, and that the reason why food prices have gone up so much is because of the West's role in Ukraine, and it's nothing to do with Russia. And so these sorts of health and hunger issues are much more in the political inbox than they used to be, but they still end up in these meetings mostly talking about Ukraine. So I think in terms of the opportunities to influence this year's G7, the 100 Days mission and a lot of the global health priorities that we've got, including CEPI, will be on the radar of officials who are negotiating the communiques and doing these Sherpa texts and processes. But unless there's sort of outside pressure, it won't get onto Rishi Sunak's agenda. And I think maintaining the commitment to the 100 Days mission and to CEPI and to the broader pandemic prevention, preparedness and response agenda is really, really important. And that these meetings are an important opportunity because all the leaders come together and they have to talk about what's going on in the world. And this either will or won't be one of the things they talk about. And the more that we can do to make them realize that this is something that matters to people, but also should matter to them, will mean that, you know, rather than us seeing just a sort of initiative from Japan on digital health, which would be great, there's this whole Hiroshima task force process which is going on. The health ministers are meeting, and you know, we need to keep the momentum up in terms of, they made promises as part of the 100 Days mission coming out of 2021, which they checked in on 2022, and we need to hold them accountable for the promises they've made this year as well, and drive the process forward. Because, you know, I think the most important thing about this whole PPPR agenda is that, you know, it's for life, it's not just for Christmas. You've got to keep on checking in and making sure that people are doing what they said they'd do, because actually world health systems and the world is less well prepared for the next pandemic than they were before COVID, because it had such disastrous impacts on our health systems that everything's been weakened. And if we don't do something about that, you know, we're not going to be better prepared for next time.
Thanks, Zander. That's a really well, very, very comprehensive answer about, I guess, the political context, both in terms of the opportunities, but also the challenges to keeping leaders focused on some of the health issues that we know are pretty important for all the reasons you mentioned. I just want to clarify, you mentioned a couple of terms there. PPPR, I think, is the Pandemic Preparedness. I've got it in the wrong order, haven't I? Preparedness, prevention and response. I've missed a P.
Pandemic prevention, preparedness
and response. I'd never get that quite right. And you also mentioned the Sherpa process. I think there might be some people on the call who might not have come across that. So I'll just clarify. That's a Sherpa is the kind of government official, and I won't go into why they're called that, who represent a government in the run up to one of these big international meetings like the G7 or the G20, to prepare the ground, negotiate with other countries, so that when the leaders step off the plane, it's pretty much a done deal. So the kind of getting the countries to be negotiating on these issues in advance of the meeting is really important, which is one of the reasons we've timed this action as we have, because the G7 is timed for the middle of May, I think. So we've got a bit of time to write letters and influence the process. So just thought that bit of clarification might be helpful. We've got one question in the chat, but I think I'm just going to open it up to the floor first of all. So yeah, thank you, Zander, for all of those answers. You've set out an awful lot of stuff which we can delve into. If you don't want to just unmute and shout out your question, we've got the Zoom chat box. As always, we've also got a text number for you to write into. So that's my number here, which is 07906 662 571. That's 07906 662 571. So we'll try and keep our eye on all the various channels. So yeah, does anyone want to just fire off a first question following those initial kind of openers?
Hello, it's Helen here.
Go for it, Helen.
I wondered where the World Health Organization figures in this. Do they have any part to play?
Yeah. Do you want me to take a couple, or should we do them one by one?
However you want to do it. Do you want to take another?
No, I'll do that one, and then maybe I'll do Jill's in the chat. I mean,
okay.
Yeah, the World Health Organization is completely central to all of it. I think what COVID showed, though, was the limitations of the World Health Organization, because it is like a membership body. You know, it's a UN agency. So it took them a very long time to be able to say that there was a panic in China, and to actually get in and find out what was going on. They had a similar problem in West Africa with Ebola, is that when the regional officers are saying, no, Ebola is not a problem in West Africa, the WHO in Geneva can't say, well, we can clearly see that it is, because people are dying of Ebola, so we need to get in there and get on with it. And you know, the WHO, one of the things that we've been calling for, and results have signed on to these letters too, is that there needs to be more sustained, committed core funding to the World Health Organization, because they're very reliant on project funding for specific thematic projects, which means that their institutional capacity to be able to do the things that really matter without having to get specific funding for donors is really, really limited. So, you know, an organization like CEPI can do things that the World Health Organization can't, because it's able to move quicker and it's able to sort of cut through some of that internal politics and get on with providing the manufacturing capacity and the research and development into new vaccines in different parts of the world. But, you know, the World Health Organization is a norm setter. So when it comes to things like harmonizing regulations so that a vaccine approved in one country can be used quickly in another one, the World Health Organization and then the regional health organizations like, you know, Africa CDC, Center for Disease Control, those sorts of organizations have really essential roles to play in things like surveillance, in things like harmonization of regulations and all those sorts of issues. So yeah, I mean, the World Health Organization couldn't be more important, but there are still, even if it was to be funded to do all the things that it should be able to do, there are a lot of things that they can't, which organizations like CEPI and others need to do too.
Thank you, Zander. And that's the roles of the different organisations I think is really important. So for this month's action with CEPI, we're really focusing on that research and development remit that it has, that Zander sort of expressed earlier on. Do you want to take Jill's question, which is, for those who can't see the chat, what are the blocks to an equitable distribution of a vaccine? How can we overcome them? And then a sort of subsidiary question, where are we at with the TRIPS waiver as one of those blocks? Could you say a bit more about that? So for people who don't know, I'm going to do a terrible explanation here, so Zander, you might want to improve on it. But the TRIPS waiver is that international kind of agreement, really, under the world trade rules, that enables companies or people who've done research and development or own the intellectual property rights in a thing or a product to maintain the profitability of those. And so anyone else has to be, basically isn't allowed to manufacture those things without paying royalties. And there's a waiver of those in certain very specific circumstances to enable public goods to be achieved. And I think many of us in the sort of global health community have wanted, you know, vaccines that are global public goods to be one of those things that the waiver applies to, so that companies can't retain huge profits when public health is an issue. I think that's the very basic explanation. Sandra, I think I better hand over to you.
Yeah, that was a very good explanation. TRIPS stands for Trade Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights. It is, again, one of the many disappointing things about COVID was that if ever there was an opportunity to say that the TRIPS waiver or the intellectual property around vaccines should have been waived, it should have been COVID, because more public money went into funding COVID vaccines than I think any other vaccine that's ever been developed anywhere, ever. And it was completely hideous the way in which a lot of companies made quite so much money, particularly when they'd received so much public money. So, yeah, I mean, I think during COVID times, you had the amazing situation of the US coming out in favor of a TRIPS waiver, so that the UK and EU and particularly Germany were sort of, along with the UK, were being less progressive than the Americans on intellectual property, which is a situation that, you know, we would hope never to find ourselves in, but was the case. I think negotiations, I'm not following it that closely. The People's Vaccine are doing a lot of work on this, but, you know, negotiations in the World Trade Organization, when the new Director General Ngozi from Nigeria, who used to be number 2 at the World Bank and the Nigerian finance minister, when she became head of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, there were quite a lot of hopes that there would be progress made, but it does just seem, as far as I can tell, pretty stuck. But, you know, you still have countries like South Africa and India and Brazil who are really pushing it. And it's something that just morally and logically makes sense to have a better system for whereby people in poor countries can get vaccines cheaper than people in rich countries, because these companies should make enough money off flogging vaccines in Europe and North America and in places where people can afford them to be able to provide them at a much more discounted rate than would otherwise be the case. And one of the things within CEPI, when they're negotiating their deals, is that they have an equitable access clause in them, which is designed to ensure that people get the vaccine on the basis of need rather than necessarily on the ability to pay. And in terms of the biggest blocks to equitable distribution of a vaccine, you know, COVID showed you a lot of them. Financial, political, that you get vaccine nationalism, that people want to vaccinate their own people first, and the rich countries just push their way to the front of the queue. And then you also have the practical ones of, you know, in a lot of developing countries, they have childhood vaccination programs. They don't really have adult vaccination programs. So the amount of health workers weren't there to vaccinate at the scale that was needed. I mean, you think about all of the volunteer people doing vaccines in village halls and things across the UK, there just wasn't that infrastructure or that capacity in a lot of developing countries. Then again, you know, it's not just about vaccines, they're also diagnostics, the things that diagnose, you know, we had all those COVID tests, but in a lot of poor countries and poor people, they didn't have access to them, they couldn't afford them, so they would have had COVID and never known about it, and probably put down on death certificates they died of other things. Then you've also got therapeutics that, you know, ameliorate the impact of these diseases. They wouldn't have had access to them. So, you know, I think the blocks to equitable distribution are political, financial, and then also just technical and practical. That, you know, a lot of the cold chain needed for some vaccines have to be kept at -80. It's not easy to get a cold chain to rural places that are in very hot countries easily. So that's that.
Thank you, Zander. There's quite a lot of different barriers there, and on that equitable access, I think it's a really important aspect of CEPI's kind of a way of doing things. I mean, it's probably not perfect, as many organisations that we advocate for. They could maybe do even better than they do in terms of those kinds of things, making sure that these people, the benefits of public health initiatives are available to everybody wherever they are. But I think that's absolutely critical, and this is one of the reasons why Results is advocating for it, because it is just so important that those benefits go to everybody. So, Jill, you know, thank you for that question. We've got 9 minutes left. I'm going to move on to the next question, and hopefully we'll have time for 1 or 2 more after that. Pete, you've asked, does virus weaponizing play a role in government considerations? I think I might know what you mean, but I'm not 100% sure. Do you want to ask? Do you want to give an explanation of what you're after there?
Sure. I've become aware that a lot of the controversy around the origin of the pandemic in Wuhan, and also of reports from labs in America, which indicate that there's a lot of investment in research into novel functional vaccine viruses that can be used as weapons. I don't think I'm being paranoid when I'm saying that, but I know it's part of the picture for me about how we relate to governments when we're asking governments to, our government, to give more support to vaccine development. Are they actually, you know, when they're in there with their civil servants in their offices and so on, talking about where's the money going to go? Are they going to prefer to go towards the less public research side of vaccine development, viral development? I'm not being very clear about this.
No, you are. So I think what we're asking here is how do we ensure that we get good R&D versus evil R&D? Is that part of the politics of it that we want to explore a bit?
Yeah, that's very good, Naveed. You can be my
Zander, over to you.
My personal assistant.
I mean, yeah, when I was working on extractive industry transparency, so trying to get greater transparency into the contracts signed between companies like in oil and mining and gas and developing countries to stop corruption. The phrase that we use is sunlight is the best disinfectant. And I think when it comes to vaccine R&D and this whole agenda, I think that's true, that the more transparency there is around these contracts and what they're for and where they're going to be and what they're going to be doing, and then the more accountability there is for where the money's gone, what it's been spent on, what's been produced, the better. Because I think, COVID did have a pretty disastrous effect on a lot of people's trust in governments, and a lot of things happened that were bad. And I mean, I don't know if there are bad vaccines being developed or bad viruses being developed for sort of biological weapons, but even without developing new ones, we've already got smallpox and we've already got a lot of nasty diseases that people have got in vials somewhere, even without cooking up new ones. When Bill Gates talks about the things that he's scared of, one of the things he talks about is like a dirty bomb or sort of biological terrorism. And you've had those sort of sarin gas type things and things on tubes and people releasing gases and things. And that is terrifying. And the extent to which our government or the governments are involved in that, I don't know. My experience of working in government and with a lot of these sorts of big influential organizations, I mean, I live in Frome in Somerset, so quite a lot of the people who I live around, I don't tell that I used to work for Bill Gates, because they believe that they've got microchips in their arms because of him. My experience is that generally it's cock up rather than conspiracy in these sorts of places. But that's not to say that there aren't awful things being developed by nasty people in places that none of us know about. And I think the only thing that we can do is call on the money that's coming from our taxes to be spent in ways that are transparent and are accountable.
But the whole overseas development thing, which we're paying for, is already fucked by the amount of money that's being diverted from overseas aid. It's sort of like listening to the beginning of this chat. I'm going to be asking results whether we'd be willing to take out a court case against the British government for misuse of the overseas development funds.
There are organisations who've been looking into that, Pete, and I'm happy to sort of follow that up. I haven't got time on this call. I need to do a little bit of following up where that's gone, but that's certainly an idea that some people have had. I haven't followed that for a little while, so let me get back to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, conspiracy theories. I always like the gag. I'm not paranoid; they really are out to get me. But I think on accountability, this is exactly what we're all here for, isn't it? To make sure that these kind of accountable or more accountable organisations like CEPI, who say exactly what they're going to do in their business case, what diseases they're working on, and how much money they need to do that work, is kind of what we as the public, I suppose, need to be asking for, so that at least that they know that there's a pressure to do that kind of work, rather than investing in perhaps more dubious things, whatever it may be, without anyone being asking them about what's going on. So that public accountability and democratic accountability for me is just so central to what we as results are all about. We've got 3 minutes. I think we've got maybe time for one more quick question, but Jill has just put in the chat. She's asking you, Zander, if you can maybe name a couple of books, a few books to that express some of the ideas that you were talking about during your answers, perhaps around China, around the geopolitical situation. So if you've got any thoughts, doesn't have to be now, because we've only got a couple of minutes and you can't really put you on the spot like that, but we're gonna share a recording of this this call, as I said earlier. It'll take us a week or so to get it up, but we can always, any books that anybody has got to recommend, anyone on the call, not just Zander, throw it our way, and we can put a link to it in the comments, so you can see it if you go and look at the recording, which will be accessible through our blog roll on the results website. So time for one final question, I think, and then we're going to have to wrap up.
Naveed, I've got one very quick question. This term equitable access, I've heard mentioned. Because of COVID, you were saying about Africa, Zander, some people in Africa felt they were screwed over by not getting the amount of COVID vaccines they were promised. I mean, I wonder, because of that, do you think more manufacturing and more labs will start to open up in Africa and be able to make their own vaccines, perhaps? Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, very quickly, I really hope so. I think there have been some good progress. CEPI's recently signed a $50 million deal with the Institut Pasteur in Dakar in Senegal. There are quite a lot of deals being done in South Africa. I think that there is positive momentum. And I think one of the positive things is that African governments are doing it for themselves. They're realizing that they can't just sit around and wait for rich countries to give them their sort of leftovers, that they need to that was one of the reasons they got screwed, was because they believed donor countries who said, we're going to help you. And they're like, great, okay. And then it didn't come because of politics. So, I think things are changing. I think it's harder than we would want it to be, because you can't have empty vaccine factories sitting around when there isn't a pandemic. So, you got to have enough demand from local markets to make these things commercially viable. Otherwise, they just run out of money. And then the other problem is you have, a country like South Africa is really a big hub increasingly for this stuff, but then they're having rolling blackouts, and the costs of production are much higher in Africa than they are in more expensive countries, just because you haven't got the infrastructure, you haven't got the history of having produced these things there for a long time. So it is coming, and it's coming more in the countries like Senegal, Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, as hubs for those regions. But unfortunately, I think in terms of high-income countries or rich countries feeling guilty that they did such a rubbish job during COVID, and therefore wanting to make sure they do better next time, that's happening a bit, but not nearly as much as it should do. I have more hope in organizations like CEPI, who are using the money that they've got from those donors to do stuff with countries in Africa and elsewhere, and those countries themselves realizing they need to take ownership and responsibility for investing and prioritizing in these things, which is really hard when you've got people dying of HIV and malaria and TB and these other terrible diseases. Yeah. To say, okay, well, even though we need these bed nets or we need antiretrovirals, we're still going to invest a lot of money in R&D, when a lot of R&D money doesn't work. For every one vaccine that you get, you might fund 5 very expensive trials that lead to nothing. So it's not easy. Oh yes, Jill, I have read those ones that you're suggesting. I was trying to think of Peter Frankopan, but no, Bentley, it's a great question. And I realize we've got a minute over. And the only other thing I wanted to recommend is that B. Coates, who I think is on the call, has written a brilliant paper on CEPI and knows much more about it than I do. And as and when that gets published, I'd recommend you all read it.
We will certainly be linking to that when it's published, which is imminent. Donna, thank you for that. I mean, that whole answer to that question, we could go on for another hour or more just on that question around the vaccine manufacturing capacity, and we've talked about it a bit before. We might see if we can find some links to some relevant information for that as well when we publish the link to this recording. Gosh, a lot, as we covered a lot of ground tonight, a lot of stuff around this issue, equitable access to vaccines and vaccine development in 100 days. All of which is super important, all of that geopolitical stuff, all of the national political stuff and the vested interests, it's all really, really important. But, CEPI is an organization which, through that equitable access approach, is one of the organizations that can help to solve some of those many problems. So that's why we're advocating for it this month. We're going to just put a link in for anybody who hasn't got it to our April action materials. There it goes. So I hope you have found this call interesting and it's inspired you to take action. Zander, thank you so much for being with us. It's been a real tour de force. And thank you everybody, of course, for joining us and for all of your efforts in advance. So this month, rather than writing to your MP, I think we talked about MPs last month, we're talking about contacting the Prime Minister directly. Now, we've had some queries about that. You know, the Prime Minister is, you know, the ministerial offices are more likely to respond to MP queries than the public sometimes. However, there's a time for different approaches, and to some extent we kind of make this up. But we think that the Prime Minister has personally stated R&D to be a priority. He's put his personal backing behind this. And also, you know, if they're going to spend this money, which we're asking it to be on top of ODA money, not the existing ODA budget, which, as Pete said, is well overstretched already. That's going to be a spending decision that's going to go all the way up to the Prime Minister and the Treasury. So we do think it's a good time to be writing to him, also because there's probably 6 weeks or so before that G7 meeting where he's going to turn up in Japan and hopefully say some positive things rather than some anodyne things. We'll see. So that's why we think it's a good target. We'll see how that goes. And yeah, good luck with everything that you're going to do. Really here to answer any questions. You know that myself and Aurora are here to answer any questions you've got and support if you've got any questions about what is, you know, quite a complex topic by most people's standards. There are links in the action materials to CEPI's website and a whole load of other places that hopefully you will find useful. So it's 4 minutes past the hour. I'm going to call it a day. Thank you all, as I said. And just a reminder that the next Grassroots conference call will be at the usual time, 8 o'clock on Tuesday, the 2nd of May. So thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your evenings.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Naveed.
you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Look after yourself.
Thank you. Bye, Corinne. Bye, Jill.
Bye.
Bye.
Everybody.
Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Bye, Naveed.
Bye, Pete.
Thanks, Naveed.
Bye, everybody.